Welcome to The Last Climb. Today, we're going to uncover the Everest expedition where a father believed years of success had made his family ready for the world's highest mountain. Years of believing experience could replace expertise convinced him the risks didn't apply to his family, and he ignored warning after warning from the people who knew the mountain best. Knowing what happened next, every decision on that mountain becomes harder to understand. It was April 10th, 2012, when a long flight from the United States finally landed at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu. It had been almost 2 days of travel, and along with all the usual luggage, there was expedition gear mixed in too, just coming through like normal baggage. Kieran Solmare, 38, was the one leading it all. Back home in Boulder, Colorado, he'd spent years building this personal training business. But more than that, he'd built this image around extreme outdoor family adventures. He'd done Kilimanjaro back in 2008 and then Aconcagua in 2010. Both went fine, no real issues. But the thing is, he didn't actually have formal mountaineering certifications, and he hadn't gone through any real altitude medicine training either. 2 summits with no serious problems. I understand why that felt like proof of something. I just think he was reading the wrong thing into it. Most of what he knew about high altitude climbing came from experience, reading, and just figuring things out as he went. And in his mind, those earlier summits kind of proved he was ready to take his family even higher. His wife, Alessia Solmare, 35, worked as a certified yoga instructor. She also co-authored a self-published book about raising kids through outdoor experiences. She had been with him on Kilimanjaro before, though she didn't go all the way to the top that time. On this expedition, she was mostly handling organization and planning side of things, while the bigger technical and risk decisions were really being made by Kieran. Their son, Kiris, was 8 years old, and he wasn't new to mountains either. He had already done several high hikes for his age Colorado 14ers, even a guided climb of Mount Whitney. He was fit, used to pushing himself, and honestly, he'd picked up a lot of his father's mindset too, like seeing tough conditions as something you just push through. And then there was their daughter, Alarise, who was 6. She'd done some lower mountain hikes in Colorado, but nothing close to the same level as her brother. Compared to everyone else in the group, she was much less experienced at that altitude. People who saw her during the trip later said she was pretty quiet, kind of withdrawn in unfamiliar places, not really talking much with guides or anyone else. And in that whole intense environment, that silence stood out even more. The Everest attempt had been publicly framed by Kieran as the culmination of a long-term philosophy of deliberate exposure to extreme environments. Over several years, the family's outdoor activities had been documented online and presented as progressive proof that conventional limits were psychological rather than physical. A crowdfunding campaign supported the expedition, explicitly emphasizing the rarity of a family attempt at Everest with children of their ages, framing it as validation of a carefully built trajectory rather than an exception to standard mountaineering norms. The expedition operator that arranged the Solmare family's place on the climb reviewed their permits and waivers and confirmed they met all legal requirements in Nepal. A licensed Nepali lead guide with 11 seasons of Everest experience met the family in Kathmandu during the pre-expedition period between April 10th and April 18th. After reviewing the situation, he raised concerns about the children's ages in a written message to the operator. He was told the documentation was valid and that there was no legal reason to refuse participation. He remained assigned to the expedition. He put his concern in writing and was told it didn't matter, and then he was kept on the expedition anyway. I keep coming back to that, like what that must have felt like. So in situations like this, who actually gets to go on the expedition really comes down to the permit holder and the company running it. It's not like there was a strict age check or anything like that at the time. Nepal's rules back then didn't clearly set a minimum age for guided trips above base camp, as long as all the paperwork was in order and the required waivers were signed. In this case, Kieran Solmare was the one holding the permit, so he basically had the main say over who was included in the family team. His past climbs, those earlier summits he'd done, were used as part of the application, kind of like proof that he knew what he was doing. And Alessia, his wife, she backed that up too. She signed off on the declarations describing the kids as being prepared and having enough prior exposure. So between the paperwork and their stated experience, everything was presented in a way that supported the idea that the family was ready for the expedition. The operator relied on standard risk acknowledgement procedures and did not conduct separate pediatric medical screening beyond general fitness disclosure. Concerns raised by the lead guide regarding the children's ages were documented but did not constitute grounds for refusal under contractual terms. As a result, inclusion proceeded under legal compliance, parental authorization, and operator acceptance, despite non-binding safety concerns raised during pre-expedition review. Mount Everest sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet at 29,032 feet. From the Nepal side, the route begins with a trek to Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet, followed by a climb through the Khumbu Icefall, then the Western CWM, and higher camps leading toward the summit. I'll be honest, every time I map this route out in my head, it stops sounding like a climb and starts sounding like a chain of decisions stacked on top of each other. The Khumbu Icefall is the section between Base Camp and Camp 1. It is unstable, with moving ice, deep crevasses, and collapsing ice towers. Climbers cross it using fixed ropes and ladders, and conditions can change from day to day. Above this, the route continues through higher camps where oxygen levels steadily drop. At Base Camp, oxygen is about half of sea level. By Camp 2, it is lower still. Most climbers follow a slow rotation schedule, going up and down over several weeks to adjust to the altitude. At extreme altitude, low oxygen affects the body and brain. In severe cases, this can lead to high-altitude cerebral edema or high-altitude pulmonary edema. Both conditions worsen with continued exposure and require immediate descent for treatment. During the spring climbing season, temperatures along the route range from mild cold at Base Camp to extreme sub-zero conditions at higher camps, with strong wind chill common near Camp 2. The main summit attempts are usually planned for a short weather window in May, after weeks of acclimatization rotations. So, the trek up to Everest Base Camp actually takes about 8 days from Lukla, which is the small airstrip sitting at around 9,383 feet. From there, the trail just keeps climbing through a string of mountain villages, each one higher than the last. You've got Namche Bazaar at about 11,286 feet, then places like Tengboche, Dingboche, and Farish, which sits around 14,340 feet, and after that you finally reach the rocky moraine at Base Camp. It's basically a built-in acclimatization route, so people usually take rest days along the way just to let their bodies adjust to the altitude. The Solmir family started that trek on April 19th. At first, things were pretty normal, nothing really stood out. Kiris, the son, was keeping pace with everyone just fine. Alaris also managed to keep up, though one of the Sherpa porters later mentioned she was very quiet the whole time, just moving along without really saying much. He didn't really interpret it as anything at the time, just noted it. My attention keeps locking onto that detail about her walking slightly behind, because that's the kind of small separation that's easy to miss in a group moving this slow and this spread out. When they reached Namche Bazaar, though, things started to shift a bit. Alaris wasn't eating much, she wasn't sleeping well, and over those 2 days she just seemed more and more withdrawn. The guide later described her as unusually quiet, not exactly in distress, but definitely not herself either. Still, Kieran put it down to normal travel fatigue, and instead of adding extra rest days, the group just kept moving forward. By the time they reached Farish, there was even a stop at a Himalayan Rescue Association post where staff offered general advice about altitude health and how to monitor symptoms. But Kieran turned down a formal checkup, saying they were on schedule and that he already understood how this part of the climb worked. So they didn't stay long, they just continued on toward Base Camp. Someone left a comment on a previous Everest video that I've honestly never forgotten. I always appreciate the insights you leave on these videos because they often stay with me while I'm putting the timeline together. That thought came back here as the Sherpa's concerns began to grow while Kieran remained confident everything was unfolded as expected. Ego will kill you. Trust the Sherpas. Great comment. Between Dingboche and Farish, a Sherpa porter carried Alaris for part of the route without informing Kieran at the time, later explaining it as a practical decision to maintain pace and avoid disruption. The group reached Base Camp on schedule. The family arrived at Everest Base Camp on April 28. At 17,600 feet, Base Camp sits on a glacial moraine at the base of the Khumbu Icefall and serves as a temporary settlement for multiple expedition teams during the climbing season. Dozens of groups share the area, and conditions are closely observed within the camp community. The family's arrival was quickly noticed by guides from other expeditions. 2 experienced lead guides, with more than 60 Everest summits combined, observed them shortly after they set up camp. Neither approached the Salmirs, but both independently expressed concern in private. 60 summits between them, and neither one said a word directly. I'm not criticizing that, I just think about what it's like to watch something unfold and feel like it's not your place to intervene. That evening, the family's crowdfunding page posted arrival photos that received positive public responses. At the time, Everest permits weren't really based on age limits. It came down to paperwork and whether a licensed operator approved the expedition. Nepal didn't have a clear minimum age rule for guided climbs like this, as long as the documentation and waivers were in place. Here, the operator confirmed everything was signed and compliant, so the booking was accepted and cleared to proceed. Within that framework, the parents' role was central. Kieran presented the expedition as part of a long-standing philosophy of progressively exposing his children to extreme environments, pointing to their previous climbs as evidence of readiness. Alessia supported the family's public narrative and managed much of its external documentation. Together, their consent and stated intent satisfied the non-medical requirements for inclusion under the operator's policies. Standard acclimatization practice required several rest days at base camp before the first ascent into the icefall. Kieran pushed to begin earlier than planned, citing experience and preparation. The lead guide attempted to delay the rotation, but did not have the authority to override the permit holder's decision. He chose to remain with the family and lead the first rotation into the icefall. The traverse through the Khumbu Icefall on May first took the Salmir children about 9 hours. For comparison, fully acclimatized adult climbers usually do that same route in around 4 to 6 hours. Kiris made it through on his own, but by the end he was clearly exhausted when they reached the top of the icefall. Alaris, though, needed help in the final section. 2 Sherpas had to physically assist her, basically guiding her through parts she couldn't manage alone. At Camp 1, a Sherpa checked their oxygen levels with a pulse oximeter. Just for context, that device measures blood oxygen saturation. And at that altitude, acclimatized adults usually sit somewhere around 75 to 85%. Kiris was at 74%. Alaris was at 68%. Those numbers were passed up to the lead guide, who then told Kieran. But Kieran questioned whether the device was accurate and treated it as normal variation. If it were me standing there getting those readings, that's the exact moment I'd start slowing everything down, not trying to explain them away. But later that same day, instead of staying overnight, the whole team went back down to base camp. The rest period between May 3 and May 7 was meant to allow the family's bodies to adapt after the first rotation. On May 3, Kiris developed a headache consistent with mild acute mountain sickness. It improved over the next 2 days with rest and hydration. Alaris remained quiet throughout the period. She ate less than usual, slept more, and did not report symptoms unless asked directly. During this time, an expedition physician from another base camp team, an emergency medicine doctor from Arizona in his 4th Everest season, offered to examine both children as a precaution. Kieran declined, stating that the children were prepared for altitude and that additional medical input was unnecessary. The second rotation was scheduled to begin on May 8th. The second acclimatization rotation took them from base camp back up through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1, and then the plan was to push higher the next day to Camp 2 at about 21,300 feet before returning again to base camp. That Camp 2 night is usually a really important step since it helps the body adjust before going even higher later on. At Camp 1 though, Alaris didn't do well overnight. She had intermittent vomiting and barely ate or drank. At first, it was treated as a mild altitude reaction mixed with exhaustion from the icefall crossing. Nothing neurological was noted at that point, so the team still followed the plan. But the next morning, during the start of the climb toward Camp 2, things became more concerning. Within the first hour, her coordination was off, and her reactions were noticeably slower. Even then, it was still being read as worsening acute mountain sickness, not something that would immediately trigger an evacuation. On May 9, the western CWM stretched ahead from Camp Pine early morning light, a wide glaciated valley between Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse. Conditions were clear and cold, with light wind across the snow. Although the terrain is relatively flat compared to higher sections of the mountain, the altitude places significant strain on the body due to reduced oxygen availability. Within the first hour of the ascent through the western CWM, Alaris's movement deteriorated beyond expected altitude fatigue. Her gait became unsteady, and she showed impaired coordination and spatial awareness. She had not spoken for an extended period. The observations were reported to the lead guide and passed to Kieran, who maintained that she was experiencing fatigue and would recover upon reaching Camp 2. The group reached Camp 2 in the afternoon and placed Alaris inside a tent and sleeping bag. As the day progressed, multiple members of different teams independently noted that she was unable to stand steadily, had difficulty focusing her eyes, and responded slowly or inconsistently when spoken to. Her oxygen saturation measured 61% at Camp 2. I don't have medical training, and even I know that number is not ambiguous. She showed marked neurological impairment, including unstable gait, delayed responses, and impaired visual tracking. Sherpa assessment identified high-altitude cerebral edema and recommended immediate descent with oxygen support. So at that point, concern about Alaris was starting to build pretty clearly. Some of the Sherpas who were directly involved in helping her move were actually recommending that they stop the rotation at Camp 1 and bring her down. From what they were seeing, her worsening coordination and those early neurological signs, they felt it was no longer something to push through. In their experience, especially with someone that young, the safer call was usually to descend early rather than continue upward. But there wasn't a full agreement across the team. The lead guide did acknowledge what the Sherpas were saying, but also pointed out that at that altitude, symptoms can overlap a lot. Fatigue, acute mountain sickness, and more serious issues can look very similar in the moment, so it wasn't completely straightforward. Because of that uncertainty, the decision didn't get made right away. The Sherpas were leaning towards stopping the rotation, while the lead guide held off on a final call, saying they needed confirmation from the expedition operator first. At that stage, halting the rotation wasn't something they could just do instantly under standard procedure, so things were left in that brief but tense pause while they waited for direction. Kieran maintained that the symptoms were consistent with expected acclimatization response and requested continuation to Camp 2 for further observation under controlled conditions rather than an immediate descent. As a result, no single authority executed a full stop at Camp 1, and the team proceeded with heightened monitoring rather than a formal reversal of the rotation. During the ascent toward Camp 2, Alaris's condition continued to decline, though the severity was initially interpreted as worsening altitude intolerance rather than definitive high-altitude neurological failure. Only upon arrival at Camp 2 did the combination of severe hypoxia and neurological impairment become clearly consistent with a serious altitude-related injury, prompting the lead guide to initiate an immediate descent under safety protocol. The descent continued through the night in the western CWM between Camp 2 and Camp 1. Temperatures were well below freezing. Headlamps moved across uneven snow and glacier terrain. Two Sherpas carried Alaris on an improvised litter. She was not fully conscious, with intermittent brief periods of eye-opening that showed no clear awareness of her surroundings. Kieran descended on foot but required close supervision from a Sherpa due to worsening coordination and fatigue. Kieran walked independently at the rear of the group and did not physically assist either child during the descent. I've read that line 3 times and I still don't fully know what to do with it. Alessia followed behind the litter carriers, staying with the group under guidance from the Sherpas. The group reached Camp 1 early the following morning. On arrival, the Sherpa carrying Alaris noted a marked change in her condition. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, with a wet sound that was audible at close range. Her lips and fingertips showed a blue-gray discoloration consistent with low oxygen levels. Her pulse was rapid and weak. The lead Sherpa identified the condition as high-altitude pulmonary edema, in addition to the previously observed neurological symptoms consistent with high-altitude cerebral edema. The combined conditions indicated severe altitude-related illness, requiring immediate descent and intensive intervention. The team then brought out a GAMO bag, which is basically a portable, inflatable chamber used in high-altitude emergencies. It works by increasing the air pressure around the patient, so it simulates being at a lower altitude and can help relieve symptoms. But it's not a set-and-forget system. it has to be continuously pumped by hand to keep the pressure up. So 2 Sherpas took turns doing that in shifts to keep it running. 2 people taking turns pumping a bag by hand at 19,000 feet in the dark. I want that image to land, because it should. At the same time, they also started giving supplemental oxygen from the expedition's emergency supply, running it at the highest flow available. Both of these are standard, appropriate interventions in situations like this. But their effectiveness really depends on timing, how early they're started in relation to how far the symptoms have already progressed. An emergency radio message was sent from Camp 1 down to base camp and then relayed onward to Kathmandu. After that, a helicopter rescue service contracted by the expedition operator started getting ready for an extraction. But Camp 1 sits right near the edge of where helicopters can safely operate up there around 19 to 20,000 feet. And at that altitude, everything depends heavily on wind. If it's even slightly unstable, landing just isn't possible. The helicopter did come in later that morning. It made a low pass over Camp 1, basically circling and checking conditions, but the wind wasn't cooperating. It couldn't land. It pulled away and went back down to a lower staging area. A second attempt was talked about, but it was already clear the weather window wasn't going to improve in time, so the decision shifted to a ground evacuation instead. A litter was quickly put together at Camp 1 using tent poles and webbing, basically whatever could be adapted on the spot. When you picture that kind of setup, it really hits how improvised everything becomes up there. Sherpa teams then began the descent through the icefall. 2 Sherpas carried the litter, 2 more helped stabilize it through the technical sections, and 1 stayed back with the rest of the family group. The terrain itself made everything: slow ladders over crevasses, fixed ropes, constantly shifting ice underfoot. They moved like that for about 90 minutes, inching their way down. Around 18,400 feet, Alaris's breathing became irregular during transport, and then it stopped entirely while she was still on the litter in the icefall. Kiris and Alessia were still conscious, but they were clearly breaking down from exhaustion, moving slower and slower, with coordination slipping from prolonged low oxygen stress during the descent. Kieran was still walking on his own at that point, but even he had noticeably slowed under the same conditions. After arrival at a stable section of the icefall, Alaris was confirmed unresponsive, with no detectable breathing or pulse. The remaining individuals later deteriorated during extended stabilization efforts under extreme altitude, cold exposure, and physical exhaustion, rather than collapsing simultaneously. Sherpa personnel initiated resuscitation measures, including CPR and supplemental oxygen where available. Efforts were rotated due to terrain instability and severe environmental conditions. A gammo bag remained at Camp 1 and was not accessible during the icefall descent. Despite continuous resuscitation attempts, none of the 4 individuals regained breathing or cardiac activity. All 4 were declared deceased at the scene in the Khumbu icefall. It's hard to even sit with how quickly medical efforts turn into pure survival logistics at that altitude, with no stable place to actually work. Recovery personnel noted that the combination of extreme altitude, exhaustion, and delayed definitive medical support made survival beyond this point medically implausible. The group then began a controlled descent out of the icefall with the assistance of Sherpa teams. No criminal charges were filed under Nepali law following the incident. The expedition operator's seasonal permit was suspended pending administrative review, and authorities launched a broader assessment of permitting practices for expeditions involving minors. In the following year, Nepal's Mountaineering Authority issued a non-binding recommendation urging stricter minimum age considerations for climbs above base camp, especially for routes involving the Khumbu icefall and higher camps. A post-incident autopsy conducted in Kathmandu confirmed the cause of death for all 4 individuals as combined high-altitude cerebral edema and high-altitude pulmonary edema. Medical examiners noted evidence consistent with severe systemic hypoxia. Findings indicated that both brain and lung function had been critically compromised prior to the final descent phase. Review of expedition data, witness statements, and recorded oxygen saturation logs suggested that all 4 individuals had already entered irreversible stages of altitude-related organ failure before the descent from Camp 2 was completed. Medical reviewers concluded that, Given the severity and progression of hypoxia observed in the recorded timeline, survival would not have been medically feasible without immediate, sustained high-flow oxygen support and rapid evacuation at the earliest onset of neurological symptoms.